The floor was not just hard, it was cold enough to burn. That was the first thing Lotte Schneider understood when she lay down on the wooden planks in the converted warehouse outside Aachen, Germany, on the night of January 15th, 1945. The cold did not creep or settle. It attacked, radiating upward from the concrete beneath the thin boards, passing through cloth and skin and muscle until it reached bone. She was 22 years old. 3 weeks ago, she had been a Luftwaffe signal auxiliary in Bonn, routing communications through switchboards in an underground bunker that smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. 2 weeks ago, the American advance had overrun her position during the Rhineland offensive, and she had surrendered along with 46 other women from her unit. 1 week ago, she had been loaded onto a truck with no heat and no explanation, driven west through snow and mud and the skeletal remains of German towns, and deposited here in this warehouse that still had a roof but no windows, no beds, and no mercy for bodies that had not rested in days. Now she lay on her back with her single army blanket pulled to her chin, a folded coat beneath her head, and the coal floor beneath everything else. Around her, other women were doing the same, arranging themselves in rows on the wooden planks like bodies in a morgue. Some whispered to each other in German. Most were silent, too exhausted for conversation, too numb for anything but the animal need for sleep. The warehouse had been a factory once, ball bearing, someone said. The Americans had cleared out the machinery and left only the shell of vast space with concrete floors and walls that absorbed cold like a sponge. The roof was intact, which was something. The walls had windows, or had once had windows, but most of the glass was gone now, replaced with boards that did not quite fit, leaving gaps where wind came through in thin cutting streams. The temperature outside was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, it might have been 10 degrees warmer, but not much more than that. Cold was cold. After a certain point, the difference between 5 degrees and 15 degrees was academic. Lotte had been cold before. Everyone in Germany had been cold for years. Winters without coal, apartments with broken windows, train stations where you waited for hours in the open air because the waiting rooms had been bombed. But this was different. This was not the cold of a drafty room or a long walk. This was the cold of lying still, of pressing your body against a surface that would not warm, that would never warm that drained heat faster than flesh could generate it. She shifted onto her right side. Her hip pressed against the plank, and within seconds, pain began to bloom there, a deep ache that spread into the joint. She shifted onto her left side. Same result. She tried her back again, then her stomach. Every position hurt within minutes. The thin wooden boards offered no cushion, no give. They were just hard surfaces separated from concrete by a few centimeters of air, and that air trapped cold the way a thermos traps heat. Around her, other women were shifting too. She could hear the creak of planks, the rustle of blankets, the small, involuntary sounds of people trying to find comfort where none existed. Someone nearby whispered something in German. Lotte did not catch the words, but she understood the tone. Pain, frustration, the realization that sleep, which had seemed so close, was going to be impossible. She tried to relax, tried to let her muscles go soft, to breathe slowly, to ignore the ache in her hip and shoulder and the cold pressing into her spine. Her father had taught her this once when she was a child afraid of the dark. Relax your body starting from your toes. Work your way up. By the time you reach your head, you will be asleep. It had worked then. It did not work now. Her toes were numb. Her calves were stiff. Her hips throbbed with each heartbeat. Relaxation was not possible when every nerve was screaming. How long had she been lying here? 20 minutes, 30. It felt like hours. Time moved differently when you were in pain, stretching and warping until minutes became lifetimes. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling, at the exposed beams and the shadows cast by the few electric lights the Americans had strung up. The lights were dim, meant to conserve power, and they gave the warehouse the atmosphere of a cave, all dark corners and uncertain edges. She thought about her mother, about her 2 younger sisters. They were still in Bonn as far as she knew. The city had been bombed repeatedly over the past year, but the last letter she had received back in December said the apartment building was still standing, that they were managing, that they missed her and prayed for her safety. She had not been able to write back. There had been no time, no paper, no postal service that functioned in those final chaotic weeks before her capture. Did they know she was alive? Did they know she had been taken prisoner? Or did they think she was dead, buried under rubble somewhere, just another name on a list that would never be compiled, because there were too many names and not enough people left to write them down? She pushed the thought away. Thinking about her family made the cold worse, somehow made the present moment feel more unbearable. She needed to focus on getting through this night. One night, then tomorrow night, then the night after that. However many nights it took until the war ended and they sent her home. Assuming they sent her home. Assuming home still existed. A sound nearby pulled her attention. Someone sitting up, then another person, then a third. Lottie raised her head slightly and saw women along her row abandoning their attempts to lie down, sitting instead with their backs against the wall, or just sitting upright in place, arms wrapped around their knees, blankets pulled around their shoulders. She was not the only one who could not endure it. She sat up too. Her hip throbbed where it had pressed against the plank, but sitting was better than lying. At least sitting, the pain was distributed differently, spread across her buttocks and lower back, instead of concentrated in a single joint. The cold was still there, still radiating up from below, but it was more bearable when she could move, when she could shift her weight every few minutes instead of staying locked in one position. Across the warehouse, more women were sitting up now, maybe half of them. The ones who remained lying down were either asleep, which seemed impossible, or so exhausted they could not move, or simply more stubborn than the rest. Lottie watched them with a mix of envy and pity. How were they managing it? Or were they managing it at all? Maybe they were just lying there in silent agony, too proud or too afraid to admit defeat. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Heavy boots on concrete. Lotta turned and saw an American soldier walking along the perimeter, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath visible in the cold air. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, with a round face that still had the softness of adolescence. He wore a thick wool coat and gloves and a helmet with netting, and even from a distance, Lotte could see he looked warmer than anyone in this room. He stopped when he noticed the movement, the women sitting up instead of lying down. He stood there for a moment watching his face unreadable. Then he started walking toward them, his boots loud in the otherwise quiet space. Lotte felt a flicker of fear. She had been a prisoner for 2 weeks, and in that time she had learned that American soldiers were not the monsters the propaganda had described. They had not shot her on sight. They had not tortured her. They had processed her through a system that seemed bureaucratic rather than brutal, taking her name and her unit and her photograph, checking her for weapons and contraband, feeding her thin soup and hard bread, and sending her onward to this place. But she had also learned that soldiers were unpredictable. Rules could be bent. Authority could be abused. And she was sitting up when she had been ordered to lie down and rest. The soldier stopped a few meters away. He looked at the women sitting up, then at the ones still lying down, then back at the ones sitting. His expression was confused rather than angry, and that was something. Confused meant he did not understand what was happening. Anger would have been worse. He pointed at the floor, then made a lying down gesture with his hands. The meaning was clear. Lie down, follow orders. No one moved. Lotte glanced at the women around her. Some looked away, others stared at the floor. One older woman, Elsie Hartman, met the soldier's gaze with defiance, her jaw set, her eyes hard. Else was 44, a Wehrmacht clerk who had been in the military longer than Lotte had been alive. She did not trust the Americans. She did not trust anyone. The soldier repeated the gesture, more emphatic this time. Lie down. He said something in English, his tone firm, but not shouting. Lotte caught a few words. Orders, sleep, rest. Her English was functional, learned in school before the war, but his accent was American, different from the British English her teachers had spoken, and she had to work to parse the meaning. She made a decision. It was a risk, but sitting here in defiance was also a risk, and at least speaking might give them a chance to explain. She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, keeping her posture non-threatening. The soldier's eyes locked onto her immediately, and she saw his body tense, his hand moving closer to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Please, she said in English, the word careful and clear. We try to lie down, but it hurts. The soldier's hand stopped moving toward the rifle. His expression shifted from wariness to confusion again. Hurts, he repeated. The words sounded strange in his accent, the R harder than it should be. You hurt. You injured, Lotte shook her head. No, injured. She pressed her hand flat against one of the wooden planks, then touched her own back. Floor, she said, very cold, like ice. We cannot rest. The soldier looked down at the planks, then back at her. Cold, he said, as if the word did not quite make sense. Yes, Lotta said. She searched for more words, trying to explain something that should be obvious, but apparently was not. Cold goes into bones. Hips hurt. Shoulders hurt. When we lie down, pain comes. Cannot sleep. Another woman spoke up, a younger girl named Greta Newman, barely 18, her voice trembling. She spoke in German, rapid and frightened. Lotta turned and saw tears on Greta's face. The girl had been conscripted just 3 months ago, pulled out of a Munich factory, and sent to a flak battery with almost no training. She was terrified of everything. Terrified of the Americans, terrified of the cold, terrified of what would happen next. Lottie reached out and touched Greta's shoulder, steadying her. In German, she said, "Be calm. I am trying to explain." The soldier was watching this exchange, and though he did not understand the words, he seemed to understand the emotion. He looked at Greta, at her tears, at the way she hugged herself, and something in his expression changed. Not pity exactly. Something more like recognition, as if he was seeing something familiar in her fear. He knelt down suddenly right there in front of them. Lotta took a step back, startled. He was not kneeling in submission or surrender. He was kneeling to inspect the floor. He pulled off his right glove, and Lotta saw his hand was red from cold, even though he had been wearing gloves. He placed his bare palm flat on the wooden plank, pressing down, holding it there. 5 seconds passed. 10, 15. Lotta watched his face. At first there was nothing, then a flicker of discomfort, then a wince. At 30 seconds, he pulled his hand back and looked at it, at the red mark the cold wood had left on his palm. He flexed his fingers, and Lotta saw they were stiff. He stood up, his face different now. Not confused anymore. Understanding. He looked at the women sitting up, at the ones still lying down, at the thin blankets, in the wooden planks, in the concrete beneath. He said something in English, half to himself, half to them. Lotta caught the words Jesus and freezer, though she did not understand the full sentence. Then he looked at her. His eyes were brown, she noticed. Young eyes, but not unkind. "I will see what I can do," he said slowly, enunciating each word as if he knew she was translating in her head. "Thank you," Lotte said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "Thank you for listening." He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his boots echoing again on the concrete. Lotte watched him go until he disappeared through a doorway at the far end of the warehouse. Around her, the other women were watching too, their faces skeptical. Elsa Hartmann spoke first, her voice low and bitter. "He will not do anything. They never do." Lotte did not answer. She sat back down on the plank, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. Elsa was probably right. The soldier had listened, yes. He had tested the floor himself, yes. But listening and acting were different things. Soldiers followed orders. They did not make decisions on their own. And even if he wanted to help, what could he do? Bring mattresses out of thin air. Rebuild the warehouse overnight. She closed her eyes and tried again to find some position that did not hurt. She lay on her right side, her hip pressing into the plank, and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. At 10, the ache began. At 20, it became sharp. At 30, she rolled onto her back, started counting again. Same result. She sat up, pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped the blanket tighter. This was going to be a long night. Time passed in that strange elastic way it does when you are exhausted but cannot sleep. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like minutes. Lotte drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep, more like a dazed state, where thoughts blurred together and she lost track of where she was. Once she thought she was back in Bonn in her childhood bed, warm and safe. Then she opened her eyes and saw the warehouse ceiling and remembered. Around her, other women were doing the same. Sitting, lying, sitting again. Whispering to each other, crying quietly. Some had given up entirely and were just sitting with their backs against the wall, blankets pulled over their heads, waiting for morning. Lottie envied them. At least they had stopped fighting. There was a kind of peace in surrender, even if it was just surrender to discomfort. She checked the watch she had somehow managed to keep through 2 weeks of captivity. It was after 11. They had been told to lie down at 9. 2 hours of this. How many more until dawn? 6. 7, the thought was unbearable. Then she heard the footsteps again. Multiple sets this time. Heavy boots, more than one person. She turned and saw the young soldier returning, and he was not alone. Behind him came another soldier, older, maybe in his 30s, with stripes on his sleeve. A sergeant, Lotta guessed. And behind them, 2 more soldiers, and these 2 were carrying something. Blankets. Folded gray wool blankets, stacked high in their arms. Lotte sat up straighter. Around her, other women were noticing too, turning to watch, their faces a mix of hope and suspicion. The sergeant stopped and said something to the young soldier, his voice low. Lotte could not hear the words, but she could see the sergeant was not happy. The young soldier replied, his voice calm, his tone respectful but firm. The sergeant said something else more emphatic. The young soldier gestured at the women at the floor, at the blankets in the other soldier's arms. The sergeant shook his head, but it was not a refusal. It was the shake of someone who disagreed but was not going to stop what was happening. The young soldier turned toward the women and made a gesture, beckoning them to move back slightly to clear space on the floor. Then he and the other soldiers began spreading the blankets directly on top of the wooden planks, not handing them out, spreading them, doubling them over, creating a thicker layer between the planks and the women's bodies. Lotte stood and watched, not quite believing what she was seeing. The soldier caught her eye and nodded toward one of the sections where blankets had been laid. "Try now," he said. She hesitated. This felt like a trick or a test or something she did not understand, but she was too tired to question it. She walked over to the doubled blankets, knelt down, and lowered herself carefully. The difference was immediate. The cold was still there, yes, but it was muffled, now slowed. The doubled wool created a barrier that the single thin blanket had not, and the pressure on her hip was softer, cushioned by the extra fabric. Not comfortable, not warm, but bearable. She looked up at the soldier. "Is better," she said in English. "Much better. Thank you." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to say it was nothing, just practical. Then he moved to another section and began spreading more blankets, and the other soldiers did the same. The sergeant stood watching, arms crossed, his face still unhappy, but not interfering. Other women were testing the blankets, now lowering themselves tentatively, waiting for the cold to hit. When it did not hit as hard, when the pain in their hips and shoulders dulled to something manageable, their faces changed. Relief, exhaustion finally allowed to take over. Within minutes, women who had been sitting for hours were lying down, pulling their original blankets over themselves, using coats as pillows, closing their eyes. The work took perhaps 15 minutes. When the soldiers were finished, nearly the entire floor was covered with doubled blankets, creating a slightly softer, slightly warmer surface. It was not a bed. It was not even close. But it was better. It was enough. The young soldier walked past Lotte one more time. She was lying on her side now, testing whether she could hold this position. So far, the ache in her hip was manageable. She might actually sleep. "Just makes sense," the soldier said, speaking to her or to himself or to no one. "Cannot have you freezing to death. War is over for you anyway." Before she could respond, he was gone, walking toward the exit with the other soldiers. The sergeant went last, shaking his head one more time, and then the door closed behind them, and the warehouse was quiet again, except for the sound of breathing, the rustle of blankets, the small movements of bodies settling into rest. Lotte lay very still, feeling the doubled blankets beneath her, feeling the cold that was still there, but not as sharp, not as penetrating. Her hip hurt, but it was a distant hurt now, something she could ignore. Her shoulder pressed into the wool, but the wool gave slightly cushioned her. She pulled her own blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. She thought about the soldier, about how he had knelt and tested the floor with his own hand, about how he had come back with blankets, even though it clearly had cost him some argument with the sergeant, about how he had done this not because she had begged or bargained, but because she had simply said it hurt and he had believed her. "This should not surprise me," she thought, but it does. Around her, other women were falling asleep. She could hear the change in their breathing, the way it deepened and slowed. Even Greta, the frightened 18-year-old, had stopped crying and was lying curled on her side, her face peaceful for the first time since capture. Even Elsa, the bitter 44-year-old cynic, had her eyes closed, though her face remained hard even in sleep, as if she could not let go of her anger, even in unconsciousness. Lotte felt her own body beginning to relax. The pain in her joints was receding. The cold was becoming background noise, something present, but no longer demanding attention. Her thoughts began to blur at the edges, losing their sharp focus, drifting toward the formless chaos that preceded sleep. Her last conscious thought was a question. Why did he do that? Not the practical reason. She understood the practical reason. Cold prisoners might get sick, might die, might become a problem. But there had been something else in his face when he knelt and tested the floor, when he looked at Greta, crying when he shrugged and said it just made sense. Something that looked almost like recognition. As if he saw them not as enemy prisoners, not as numbers to be processed, but as people who were cold and needed warmth. People who were someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's friend. People like him. The question followed her into sleep, unanswered but important. And when she woke 6 hours later, stiff and sore, but actually rested for the first time in 3 days, the question was still there waiting. Outside, dawn was breaking over the ruined landscape of Western Germany. The war was not over yet, not officially, but everyone knew it would be soon. A matter of weeks, maybe days. And when it ended, Lotte would have to go home, back to Bonn, back to whatever remained of the apartment building, and the city, and the life she had left behind. She would have to face her mother and her sisters and tell them what had happened, where she had been, what she had done. And she would have to tell them about this night, about the cold floor and the pain, and the American soldier who brought blankets, because it just made sense. She was not sure they would believe her. She was not sure she believed it herself. But it had happened. The blankets were still there beneath her, doubled and gray and real. The warmth they provided was real. The sleep she had finally achieved was real. What it meant she did not know yet, but it meant something. Of that she was certain. Morning came with the sound of boots on concrete and a voice shouting orders in English. Lotte woke disoriented, her body stiff from lying in one position too long, her mind slow to remember where she was. The warehouse, the blankets, the cold that had receded enough to let her sleep, but had never truly left. She sat up slowly, feeling the ache in her back and hips, the stiffness in her neck. Around her, other women were doing the same, moving, like old women, even though most of them were young, their bodies aged overnight by cold and hard surfaces and the accumulated exhaustion of weeks without real rest. The voice belonged to the sergeant from last night, the one who had been unhappy about the blankets. He stood near the entrance with a clipboard calling out instructions through a translator, a thin German woman in civilian clothes who looked almost as tired as the prisoners. Reveille at 0600. Breakfast in 30 minutes. Work assignments at 0800. Anyone with medical complaints report to the nurse. The rules were simple and clear, delivered without emotion, as if the sergeant were reading a train schedule. Lotte stood and folded her blanket, the one that had covered her, not the doubled ones on the floor. Those remained where they were, she noticed. The Americans had not taken them back. Around her, other women were doing the same, folding their blankets, running hands through their hair, preparing for whatever the day would bring. The warehouse looked different in daylight, less cave-like, more industrial. The broken windows showed gray winter sky, and through one gap she could see snow falling in slow, heavy flakes. Breakfast was oatmeal and bread, and something that claimed to be coffee but tasted like burned grain. They ate standing, using tin bowls and spoons provided by the Americans. No tables, no chairs, just 47 women in a warehouse holding bowls and trying to eat despite fingers that were still numb from cold. The oatmeal was thin but hot, and the heat mattered more than the taste. Lotte held the bowl close to her chest after she finished, letting the warmth seep into her body for a few precious moments before an American soldier collected it. She noticed that the soldier who collected her bowl was eating the same thing. She saw his bowl identical to hers sitting on a crate nearby, half full of the same thin oatmeal. He was not eating better food while they starved. He was eating their food. The observation lodged in her mind like a splinter, small but persistent. After breakfast, they were divided into work groups. Lotte ended up in a sorting detail assigned to a nearby warehouse that had been a German supply depot before the Americans captured it. Her job was simple. Go through crates of German military materials in separate items that could be salvaged from items that were ruined. Uniforms with no holes went in one pile. Uniforms with holes went in another. Same for boots, blankets, mess kits, canteens. It was not hard work, not physically demanding, but it required attention and time. 8 hours a day with a 1-hour break for lunch. The warehouse where they worked was warmer than the sleeping quarters, heated by a coal stove that an American private kept fed throughout the day. Lotta worked near Elsa Hartmann and Greta Neumann, the three of them forming a small unit within the larger group. They did not talk much. Talking was discouraged, not forbidden, but frowned upon, and besides what was there to say, they sorted through the debris of a defeated army, separating the usable from the garbage, and tried not to think too much about what it meant. At midday, they stopped for lunch. More soup, more bread. The Americans called it chow, a word that sounded harsh and functional, which it was. They ate sitting on crates in the sorting warehouse, and that was when Lot noticed the American nurse for the first time. She was a corporal, her uniform bearing a red cross on the sleeve, her face tired but professional. She walked through the warehouse, checking on women, asking questions through the translator, looking for signs of illness or injury that needed attention. When she reached Lotta's group, she paused, studying them with the practiced eye of someone who knew what to look for. "Any of you have cold symptoms?" the nurse asked through the translator. "Coughing, fever, numbness in fingers or toes?" Greta raised her hand hesitantly. "My feet," she said in German. "I cannot feel my toes." The nurse knelt and had Greta remove her boots and socks. Lotta watched as the nurse examined the girl's feet, pressing gently on the toes, checking for discoloration. After a moment, she spoke to the translator, who converted the words to German. "Early signs of frostbite. Not severe yet, but needs attention. You are excused from outdoor work. Stay near the stove. I will bring extra socks." Greta looked stunned. Excused from work because her toes were cold. It seemed impossible. But 20 minutes later, the nurse returned with thick wool socks, U.S. Army issue, and handed them to Greta with instructions to keep her feet warm and dry. Lottie watched this interaction with the same feeling she had about the oatmeal. This should not surprise me, but it does. The Americans were following rules. The Geneva Convention someone had mentioned. Prisoners of war were entitled to adequate food, shelter, medical care. These were not acts of kindness. They were acts of compliance, which somehow made them more unsettling than kindness would have been. Kindness could be refused. Kindness could be questioned. But compliance with rules, systematic care provided, not because you were likable, but because you were human, that was harder to resist. That evening, after they returned to the sleeping warehouse, after another meal of soup and bread, after the order to prepare for lights out, the women gathered in small groups to talk. This was the time when the rules relaxed slightly, when the guards allowed conversation as long as it remained quiet, as long as no one tried to leave or cause trouble. Lotta found herself sitting with Elsa, Greta, and three other women from their work detail. They spoke in German low voices that would not carry to the guards. Elsa was bitter as always. "Do not trust this," she said. "The blankets, the medical care, the food. It is all manipulation. They want us to cooperate, to inform on each other, to betray Germany." Else, Lotta said carefully, "What could we possibly tell them? We are clerks and signal operators, not generals. We do not know military secrets. They want psychological victory," Else insisted. "They want us to admit we were wrong, that Germany was wrong." One of the other women, a nurse named Margaret Fischer, spoke up. She was 35, older than most, with a calm voice that suggested she had seen enough to be past illusions. "Maybe Germany was wrong," she said. Elsa's face went red. "How dare you? My husband died at Stalingrad fighting for the fatherland." Margareta did not flinch. "My brother died there too. And my cousin at Normandy. All those deaths for what?" "For this," she gestured at the warehouse, at the broken windows, at the ruins visible beyond. "For defeat. For occupation, for knowing we will be occupied for years, maybe decades. For honor," Else said, but her voice was weaker now. "For Germany's future. We have no future else. Germany lost. The question now is not whether we were right. The question is how we survive." Lotta intervened before the argument could escalate. "Else, you do not have to like the Americans. But refusing medical care, refusing warmth, that does not hurt them. It only hurts you." Else stared at her, and Lottie saw something crack in the older woman's face, some wall beginning to crumble. "I would rather suffer with honor," Else said quietly, "than accept enemy charity." But that night, when the temperature dropped and the cold pressed in through the broken windows, when women huddled on their doubled blankets and pulled their single blankets tight, Lotte noticed that Elsie lay down like everyone else. She did not refuse the warmth the blankets provided. She did not sleep on bare planks out of pride. She lay on the doubled wool, pulled her blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. It was a small surrender, but it was a surrender nonetheless. The days developed a rhythm after that. Wake at 6, breakfast, work from 8 to noon, lunch, work from 1 to 5, dinner, free time until 9, lights out. The routine was numbing in a way that was almost merciful. It kept minds occupied, bodies moving, time passing. Lotta learned the personalities of the guards, the ones who were strict and the ones who were flexible, the ones who would talk to you if you spoke English, and the ones who pretended you did not exist. The young soldier who had brought the blankets was named Morrison. She learned this by accident, overhearing another guard call his name, Private Morrison. He was on duty most evenings, walking the perimeter of the sleeping warehouse, checking that no one tried to escape, though where they would escape to was unclear. They were 60 kilometers behind the front lines in the middle of winter in a country that was losing a war. Escape was not a realistic option. One evening, perhaps a week after the blankets, Morrison walked past Lottie as she sat with her back against the wall waiting for lights out. On impulse, she spoke to him in English. "Thank you," she said, "for blankets. We sleep now." He stopped, surprised that she had addressed him directly. He looked uncomfortable, as if gratitude embarrassed him. "Just made sense," he said. "You were freezing." Still, Lotta said, "You listen. You help." That is, she searched for the word kind. Morrison shook his head. "Not kind. Just following rules. Geneva Convention says prisoners get adequate shelter. Floor that cold is not adequate. You test floor yourself," Lottie said, "with hand. You feel cold. That is more than rules." Morrison did not answer immediately. He shifted his weight, looked away, then back at her. "You speak English pretty good," he said finally. "Where did you learn?" "School," Lottie replied. "Gymnasium in Bonn. My father was teacher. He believed education important. Was he died. 1943. Eastern Front. Russia." Silence fell between them. Lotta saw something change in Morrison's face, some calculation being made. Finally, he said, "My brother died. Last month. Hurtgen Forest." Lottie felt the words like a physical blow. She had not expected this, had not expected him to share something personal, something painful. She thought of her father, of the telegram that had arrived one winter morning saying he would not be coming home. She thought of her mother's face when she read it, the way all expression had drained away, leaving only emptiness. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "War takes everyone's brothers." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Your side started it." "I know," Lotta said, "and now we pay. All of us pay." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, and Lotta could see him working through something, some conflict between what he had been taught and what he was seeing. Then he turned away. "Get some rest," he said, and walked on. Lotta watched him go. That exchange stayed with her. His brother died fighting Germany. Maybe died fighting men from her own country, maybe even from her own region. And yet Morrison had brought blankets, had listened to her complaint, had acted to reduce suffering. Not because he had forgiven Germany, but because she suspected he could not reconcile hating an entire people with seeing individual faces, hearing individual voices, recognizing individual pain. That night, lying on the doubled blankets that were now permanent fixtures, Lotta could not sleep despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to that conversation, to the weight of what Morrison had said. Your side started it. It was true. Germany had invaded Poland, had pushed into France, into Russia, into everywhere it could reach, had started a war that killed millions and was ending now in total defeat. And she had been part of it. Not in a big way, not making decisions or fighting battles, but she had worn the uniform. She had sent the signals. She had done her job in the machine that prosecuted the war. Did that make her guilty? Was she responsible for what Germany had done? She did not know. The question was too large, too complicated. But lying in the dark, warm enough to sleep, but choosing not to, she felt the weight of it pressing on her chest like a physical thing. Around her, other women were having similar thoughts. She could tell by the way they moved restlessly, by the whispered conversations that continued long after lights out should have silenced them. One night, about 2 weeks after their arrival, a group of them gathered in the corner farthest from the guards, speaking in German so low it was almost subvocal. Margaret, the nurse, spoke first. "Did anyone else notice that the American guards eat the same rations we do?" Greta nodded. "Same oatmeal, same bread." They are not starving us, Lotte said. They are not torturing us. They follow their rules precisely. Margaret continued, which makes me feel something I did not expect to feel. Guilty, Lotte asked. Yes, Margaret said. Guilty. We were told Americans would rape us, torture us, experiment on us. Instead, they bring blankets when we are cold, medical care when we are sick. They treat us better than our own officers did in the final months. Else, who had been silent, spoke up. That is what they want you to feel. Guilt, shame. So you will cooperate. Lotte turned to her. No else. The guilt comes from inside. Because if the Americans are not monsters, then what does that make us? The question hung in the cold air. No one answered immediately. Then Margaret said what they were all thinking. It makes us people who believed lies, who followed orders, who did not ask enough questions. Greta began to cry softly. I did not do anything wrong. I just operated a radio. Lotte reached out and touched her shoulder. None of us individually did much, but together our small actions supported a system that she could not finish the sentence, could not say the words aloud, but they all knew what she meant. The camps, the deportations, the executions, the things they had heard rumors about, but never confirmed, never investigated, never stopped. Elsa's voice was harsh. Don't you dare. Don't you dare say Germany was evil. I am not talking about Germany, Lotte said. I am talking about what was done in Germany's name. We knew Else. Maybe not details, but we knew something terrible was happening. We were soldiers, Elsie insisted. We followed orders. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. And now we are prisoners being treated humanely by the people we were taught to fear. What does that tell you? Elsie had no answer. None of them did. They sat in silence, each wrapped in her own blanket, each carrying her own weight of realization. The Americans were not perfect. The food was barely adequate. The work was tedious. The warehouse was still cold at night, despite the blankets. But there was no cruelty, no random violence, no humiliation for the sake of humiliation. Just rules applied consistently, with occasional mercy beyond what the rules required. And that mercy was harder to accept than cruelty would have been. Cruelty would have confirmed everything they had been taught. Mercy forced them to question it all. Time continued its forward march. January became February. The snow kept falling. The war continued somewhere to the east, getting closer to Germany's heart every day. The women worked their 8-hour shifts, ate their thin meals, slept on their doubled blankets. They learned the routines. They learned which guards would give you a cigarette if you asked politely and which would ignore you. They learned that complaining about legitimate problems like Greta had done about her frostbite would be addressed. They learned that punishment, when it came, was proportional to offense. A woman who tried to steal extra bread lost her evening meal. A woman who refused to work was put in isolation for a day. No beatings, no public humiliation, just consequences that matched actions. It was so different from what they had known in the German military, where discipline was enforced through fear and shame, where punishment was often collective, where officers ruled through intimidation. The American system was not gentle, but it was predictable. You knew what would happen if you broke a rule. You knew what would not happen. That predictability was its own kind of mercy. One afternoon in early February, Lotte was sorting through a crate of mess kits when Morrison walked past her work area. He was carrying a clipboard doing some kind of inventory, and he stopped when he saw her. Schneider, he said, reading her name from the clipboard. That is you, right? Yes, Lotte confirmed. How are the blankets working out? Good. We sleep now, no more pain. Morrison nodded, made a mark on his clipboard. Good. He started to walk away, then turned back. You mentioned your father was a teacher. Yes. What did he teach? History and literature. He loved both. Morrison was quiet for a moment. My brother wanted to be a veterinarian, take care of animals. He was good with animals, real gentle. Lotte heard the past tense, the weight of it. I am sorry, she said again, knowing the words were inadequate. Yeah, Morrison said. War's full of sorry. He walked away before she could respond. But the exchange stayed with her. Morrison's brother had wanted to help animals, had been gentle, had died in a forest in Germany, fighting men who might have included Lotte's father if he had survived Russia. The web of connections and losses was too tangled to unravel, too painful to examine closely. So you did not examine it. You just kept going, kept sorting mess kits, kept sleeping on doubled blankets, kept surviving one day at a time. One night, 5 days later, the temperature dropped sharply. The thermometer outside the warehouse, visible through one of the broken windows, showed 15 below zero Fahrenheit. Inside was warmer, but not by much. Even the doubled blankets seemed inadequate against that kind of cold. Around midnight, Lotte woke to the sound of someone crying out. She sat up and saw several women gathered around Elsie Hartmann, who was lying on her side, shaking violently. Even in the dim light, Lotte could see Elsie's lips were blue. Greta ran to find the guard on duty. Within minutes, Morrison appeared with another soldier and the nurse, Corporal Marie Watkins. The nurse knelt beside. Elsie checked her pulse, felt her forehead, looked at her eyes. Hypothermia, Watkins said. Early stages, but serious. She needs warm liquids, heated blankets, monitoring. Else tried to speak, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. I do not want, she managed. American help. Watkins ignored her. To Morrison, she said, help me get her to the medical tent. Morrison and the other soldier lifted Elsie carefully. She was not heavy, the months of thin rations having stripped weight from all of them, and they carried her easily between them. Lotte watched them go, watched Elsie being taken away despite her protests, and felt something shift in her understanding. The Americans did not care whether Elsie wanted their help. They helped anyway. Because letting her die would violate their rules. Because their rules said every prisoner deserved medical care. Because Lotte suspected letting someone die from cold when you had the means to warm them was not something these men could do, regardless of who that someone was. Else returned the next morning, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot tea silent. Her face was no longer defiant. It was tired and confused. She sat near the stove in the sorting warehouse, excused from work for the day, and did not speak to anyone. That afternoon, Lotte sat beside her during the lunch break. How do you feel? She asked in German. Warm, Elsa said. That was all, just that one word. But the way she said it was something like wonder told Lotte everything. The nurse said you need to stay warm. Keep the extra blankets. Elsa nodded. Then so quietly Lotte almost did not hear. She said, I do not understand them. Neither do I, Lotte replied. But maybe we do not have to understand. Maybe we just have to accept what is happening. Else looked at her, and Lotte saw the wall that had been cracking finally crumble. I spent 20 years in the Wehrmacht. I believed in Germany, in duty, in honor. And now she gestured helplessly at the warehouse, at the Americans, at the ruins visible outside. Now the enemy treats me better than my own side did at the end. That is not weakness in you, Lotte said. That is failure in what we believed. Else did not respond, but she did not argue either. And that night when they lay down on the doubled blankets, when Elsie accepted the extra blanket Watkins had given her, when she pulled it close and closed her eyes, Lotte knew something had changed. Not forgiveness, not acceptance of defeat, just the beginning of something harder, the beginning of facing truth. The truth was this: they were being treated humanely by people they had been taught to hate. And that humane treatment was forcing them to confront the fact that everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed might have been built on lies. That realization was more painful than any cold floor, more devastating than any defeat. Because you could survive cold, you could survive defeat. But how did you survive the knowledge that you had been wrong about everything, that your father died for nothing, that your compliance, however small, had supported something monstrous? Lotte did not have answers. None of them did. They just had questions that grew heavier each day. And they had the strange mercy of the Americans who brought blankets when you were cold, who treated frostbite when you reported it, who saved you from hypothermia even when you said you did not want to be saved. One small act of decency at a time, the Americans were destroying the propaganda the prisoners had been raised on. Not through speeches or arguments or force, just through consistent, systematic humanity. It was the cruelest kindness Lotte had ever experienced, and she suspected it would follow her for the rest of her life. The announcement came on a gray morning in late February when the sky hung low and heavy with snow that would not fall. Lieutenant Robert Walsh, the camp commander, assembled all the prisoners in the sorting warehouse where the coal stove kept the air warm enough for breath to remain invisible. He stood on a wooden crate so everyone could see him, a translator beside him, and read from a typewritten page with the formal tone of someone delivering information that would change lives. Ladies, he began, and waited for the translation. The war situation has changed. Germany's collapse is imminent. Within weeks, perhaps days, hostilities will end. At that time, you will be repatriated to Germany through Red Cross channels. Until then, you remain here under United States military authority. The words landed differently on different women. Lotte saw Greta's face light up with relief, saw tears spring to her eyes, saw Elsa's face harden as if the announcement were an insult rather than liberation, saw Margaret close her eyes and take a slow breath, preparing herself for whatever came next. Walsh continued, "Transportation will be arranged. Identity verification will be completed. The Red Cross will help locate families and provide temporary shelter. I cannot promise the process will be quick or easy. Germany is—" He paused, searching for diplomatic words in significant disarray. Questions were permitted. Elsa asked the first one through the translator. "Will we go home immediately when the war ends?" Walsh shook his head. "It depends on logistics. We need to verify identities, arrange transportation, ensure your safety during travel. It could be weeks or months after surrender. What if our homes are destroyed?" This from Margaret. "The Red Cross will provide assistance. Temporary housing, food distribution centers. Beyond that, I cannot say. Each case will be different." Lotte raised her hand. Walsh nodded to her. "Will there be reprisals?" she asked in English, clear enough that no translation was needed. "For being captured rather than fighting to death?" Walsh looked surprised by the question. "From whom?" "From Germans. We were taught that surrender is disgrace." Walsh's expression shifted to something like pity. "Ma'am, Germany will be occupied by Allied forces. Anyone who threatens you for surrendering will answer to us. You are not returning to the Germany you left. You are returning to an occupied zone under military governance." The implications of that statement spread through the warehouse like ripples through water. Not returning to Germany, returning to an occupied zone, returning to a country that no longer existed as they had known it, returning to ruins and foreign soldiers in a future no one could predict. That night, lying on the doubled blankets that had become familiar over 6 weeks, Lotte could not sleep. Around her, other women whispered to each other, processing the news, trying to imagine what home would look like. Greta was saying she wanted to see Munich again, wanted to find her mother and sisters, wanted to sleep in her own bed. Margaret was saying Berlin was probably rubble, that everyone she knew was likely dead, that going home meant going to a graveyard. And Elsa said nothing, just lay on her side staring at the wall, her face empty of expression. Lotte thought about Bonn, about the apartment building where she had grown up, the one with the creaky stairs, and the neighbor who played violin badly, and the bakery on the corner that made bread so good you could smell it from 3 blocks away. How much of that still existed? The last letter from her mother had been in December, 3 months ago. 3 months of bombing, of fighting, of the Allied advance. Anything could have happened in 3 months. She thought about her father buried somewhere in Russia in a grave no one would ever visit. She thought about Morrison's brother buried somewhere in Germany in a grave his family might never find. She thought about all the brothers and fathers and sons buried in foreign soil and wondered what they had died for. What any of them had died for. The answer that came to her lying in the dark was nothing. They had died for nothing. Because Germany had lost. Because the Reich that promised 1,000 years was ending after 12. Because all the sacrifice and suffering and death had produced only more death, and now defeat, and now occupation, and now women like her going home to ruins with the knowledge that everything they had believed was a lie. That knowledge was heavier than any blanket could warm. March arrived with slightly warmer temperatures and longer days. The war was clearly ending. Even without official news, you could feel it in the way the guards talked, in the way supplied deliveries became less regular, in the way everyone seemed to be waiting for something inevitable. And then on a Tuesday afternoon, the announcement came over the radio in the guards' quarters loud enough that prisoners in the sorting warehouse could hear it through the walls. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. Total. Final. The reaction in the warehouse was silence. No cheers, no tears. Just 47 women stopping their work and standing very still, holding damaged uniforms or bent mess kits, staring at nothing. The war was over. They had lost. Everyone had always known they would lose, had known since Stalingrad, at least maybe earlier. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The actual moment of surrender felt like a door closing on everything that had come before. One of the younger women, barely 19, began to cry. Not from sadness exactly, from something more complicated. Relief that the dying would stop, grief for what had been lost, fear of what came next, all of it mixed together into tears that would not stop even when she pressed her hands over her face. Lotte walked over and put an arm around her shoulders. "It is over," she said quietly in German. "We survived. That is something." But what did we survive for, the girl asked through her tears. What is left? Lotte had no answer. The processing for repatriation began in May, 2 months after surrender. Red Cross officials arrived with paperwork and questionnaires and medical examinations. Each woman was interviewed separately, her identity verified against military records, her home region noted, her physical condition assessed. Lotte sat across a desk from a Red Cross worker, a middle-aged Swiss woman with tired eyes and a kind voice, and answered questions about her family, her address in Bonn, her next of kin. "Do you know if your family survived?" the woman asked. "I do not know. The last letter was in December. My mother and 2 sisters were alive then." The woman made notes. "We will attempt to locate them through our network. If they are in displaced persons camps or temporary housing, we should find them within weeks. If they are still at your last known address, you will be transported there directly. And if they are dead, then we will find you temporary housing and work assignment. Germany needs workers. Rebuilding will take years." Lotte nodded. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and gray, and she could not imagine it clearly. Could not imagine walking into Bonn and finding rubble where her home had been. Could not imagine finding her mother aged and broken by war. Could not imagine any of it. So she stopped trying. The transport was scheduled for June 20th. Lotte's group, 15 women from the Rhineland region, would travel by American truck to Bonn, where a Red Cross transit camp had been established. From there, they would be released to find their families or be assigned to temporary housing. The journey would take most of a day longer if roads were damaged or blocked. The night before departure, Morrison came to the warehouse on his final patrol. Lotte saw him and stood knowing this might be the last time she spoke to him. She walked over slowly, aware that other women were watching, that some would judge her for fraternizing with the enemy. "Private Morrison," she said. He stopped. "Schneider, you leaving tomorrow?" "Yes, to Bonn." He nodded. "I hope you find your family." "Thank you." She paused, searching for words that would carry the weight of what she wanted to say. "You gave us blankets when we were cold. You listened when we said we hurt." That changed, she gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything, many things for me. Morrison looked uncomfortable, as he always did, with gratitude. "I just did what made sense." "No," Lotte said firmly. "You did more than that. You treated us like people, when you could have treated us like enemies. That is not small thing." Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Look, I still don't forgive what Germany did. My brother's still dead. Millions are still dead because your country started this war." "I know," Lotte said. "I do not ask forgiveness. Just," she searched for the right phrase, understanding that not all of us are same. "Yeah," Morrison said. "I get that now." He shifted his weight, looked away, then back. "When you go home, when you tell people what happened here, tell them the truth. About everything, about what your government did, about the camps we're finding. Don't let people pretend it didn't happen." Lotte felt her throat tighten. "And if they do not want to hear, tell them anyway," Morrison said. "My brother died fighting your country. The least you can do is make sure people know why he had to." Lotte nodded. "I will try. I promise I will try." Morrison extended his hand, a gesture that violated regulations about fraternization with prisoners. Lotte shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "Good luck, Miss Schneider. Good luck, Private Morrison." He walked away, and Lotte watched him until he disappeared through the warehouse door. She never saw him again. But she would think of him for the rest of her life, of the blankets he brought, of the floor he tested with his own hand, of the way he looked at her, at all of them, and chose to see humans instead of enemies. The truck departed at dawn, 15 women and their small bundles of possessions loaded into the back, seated on wooden benches wrapped in blankets for the journey. The roads were worse than expected, cratered by artillery, clogged with refugees and military convoys. The trip took 14 hours instead of 8. They arrived in Bonn after dark, too late to see the damage clearly, and were taken directly to the Red Cross camp, a collection of tents and temporary buildings in what had once been a school. Lotta spent that night in a tent with 10 other women lying on a cot with a thin mattress, warmer than the warehouse floor had been, even with doubled blankets. But she could not sleep. Tomorrow she would find out if her mother and sisters had survived. Tomorrow she would see what remained of home. Tomorrow everything would become real in a way it had not been while she was a prisoner. Morning came with gray light and the sound of people moving through the camp. Lotte, dressed in the civilian clothes the Red Cross had provided, dark skirt and plain blouse, and reported to the registration tent. A worker checked her name against a list and handed her a slip of paper with an address. "Your mother and one sister are alive," the worker said, "living at this address. It is not your family's original apartment. That building was destroyed. They are in temporary housing 2 streets over." "One sister," Lotte repeated. "Not 2. According to our records, only 1. I'm sorry." The walk-through bond was worse than Lotte had imagined. 70% of the city was rubble. Entire blocks reduced to broken stone and twisted metal. The cathedral, the beautiful cathedral she had attended since childhood, was a shell with walls but no roof. The streets were full of people, refugees and residents, mixed together, all thin, all exhausted, all moving through the ruins with the blank faces of those who had seen too much. She found the address, a building that was partially intact, and climbed the stairs, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She knocked on the door, footsteps inside. The door opened. Her mother stood there, 50 years old but looking 70, hair gray that had been brown, face carved with lines that had not existed 2 years ago. She stared at Lotte for a long moment, as if not believing what she saw. Then her face crumpled. "Lotte, mein Gott, Lotte." They fell into each other's arms, both crying, holding so tight it hurt. Behind her mother, Lotte saw her younger sister, Anneliese, 16, now taller than Lotte remembered. Anneliese ran forward and joined the embrace, and for a long moment the 3 of them stood in the doorway, clinging to each other, unable to speak. Finally, they moved inside. The apartment was 2 rooms, small and dark, furnished with salvaged furniture and very little else. But it was shelter. It was home, or close enough. "Where is Trudy?" Lotte asked, though she already knew the answer from the Red Cross worker's face. Her mother's expression went blank. "October, air raid. She was at the market. The building collapsed." Lotte closed her eyes. Trudy had been 14 years old, dead under rubble because she had gone to buy bread. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 2 years apart. Her mother told her about the final months of the war, about the constant bombing, about the day the Americans arrived, and everyone hid in cellars expecting massacre, but finding instead soldiers who posted guards and distributed food and started clearing rubble. About the occupation that was strict but not cruel, organized but not oppressive. And Lotte told them about her capture, about the warehouse, about the cold floor and the blankets, and Morrison, who tested the floor with his own hand. She told them about Else and Greta and Margaret, about the guilt of being treated humanely when they had been taught to expect torture, about learning that everything they had believed was wrong. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Lotte finished, she said quietly, "The Americans here are the same. They follow their rules. They are not kind exactly, but they are fair." Anneliese spoke up for the first time. "Mama works as a translator now for the British administration. They pay her in rations." "You work for the occupiers?" Lotte asked, not judging, just surprised. Her mother met her eyes. "Someone must rebuild. Someone must make the bureaucracy function." "Would you prefer I starve on principle?" "No," Lotte said. "No, you are right." That night, Lotte slept on the floor of the small apartment, her mother and sister sharing the only bed. The floor was wooden, harder than the doubled blankets in the warehouse, but it was home. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the city sirens and shouts and the rumble of military trucks, and thought about Morrison's words. "Tell them the truth. Don't let people forget." She would try. She would tell the truth to anyone who asked. But lying there in the dark, she wondered if anyone would want to hear it. The months that followed were about survival. Lotte found work translating for the British occupation authorities, her English skills valuable in a city that needed to communicate with its occupiers. The pay was minimal, but included rations, and rations meant survival. She worked 8 hours a day, helping German civilians fill out forms for housing permits, food cards, work assignments. She saw the occupation from both sides, the Germans desperate and resentful, the British efficient and distant. In 1947, she met Franz Weber. He was 28, a carpenter who had lost his left hand at Falaise and now did one-handed work with skill that amazed everyone who watched him. He was quiet and damaged and understood without being told that she was damaged too. They married in 1948 in a brief ceremony with no celebration and moved into a rebuilt apartment that Franz had worked on himself. In 1949, their daughter Emma was born. Lotte held her and wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming knowledge that life could continue, that something new could grow from ruins. She taught Emma English from infancy, determined that her daughter would understand a world larger than Germany. In 1950, their son Klaus was born. The family was stable now. Germany was recovering. The Marshall Plan was bringing aid and hope. Life was not easy, but it was possible. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Lotte worked as an English teacher at a Bonn secondary school. She taught language, but also perspective. English connects you to the world, she told her students. Don't isolate yourselves in German, only thinking. That is what led to the war. In 1962, Emma asked her mother what she had done during the war. Lotte told her everything, about the capture, the warehouse, the cold floor, Morrison's blankets, about the guilt of being treated well when Germany had treated its prisoners terribly. Emma listened with wide eyes. The American soldier was kind, she asked. Yes, Lotte said, when he did not have to be. That is what kindness means. In 1970, Klaus asked if she had felt like a traitor working for the occupiers after the war. Lotte thought before answering. At first, yes, but then I realized Germany had betrayed itself. The occupiers were simply holding us accountable. Working with them was not betrayal. It was facing truth. In 1975, Lotte was invited to speak at a symposium at Bonn University about women's experiences in World War II. She stood before an audience of students and professors and told the warehouse story publicly for the first time. Some in the audience were angry. You are saying the Americans were good, one man challenged. I am saying they followed their rules, Lotte replied. They treated us as the Geneva Convention required. Our side did not do the same for their prisoners. That is fact, not opinion. The anger in the room was palpable. But so was the silence of those who were listening, really listening to a truth they had not wanted to face. Then in March of 1983, a letter arrived. Lotte was 60 years old now, retired from teaching, living quietly with Franz in the same rebuilt apartment. The envelope was from America, forwarded through Red Cross archives. The return address said Morrison, Patricia. Lotte's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter written in neat handwriting. Dear Mrs. Weber, formerly Schneider. You do not know me. I am the daughter of Jack Morrison, who served as a United States Army Guard at a prisoner of war facility near Aachen in January through March 1945. My father passed away in January of this year at age 57 from a heart attack. While sorting his belongings, I found a journal from the war. Most entries are brief: weather, guard duty schedules, letters from home. But one entry is longer. January 16, 1945. German women prisoners complained floor too cold to sleep on. I checked. They were right. Concrete radiating cold up through thin wood planks. Got permission from Sergeant Hayes to requisition extra blankets from supply. Laid them on floor, plus added straw. Women could finally sleep. One of them, educated, spoke English, thanked me. Said her name was Lotte Schneider from Bonn. She reminded me of Ruth, my sister. Made me realize these prisoners are just people caught in something bigger than them. Same as us. I am writing because my father never spoke about this. He never told us he served in Germany, never mentioned prisoner of war duty. We only knew he fought in Belgium, was wounded in April 1945, received a Purple Heart. The journal was a revelation. If you are the Lotte Schneider from Bonn mentioned in his journal, I wanted you to know that moment mattered to him. He wrote about it, kept it private, but it changed something. He came home quieter than when he left. Maybe seeing enemies as human did that. He taught us 3 children to treat people fairly even when we disagree with them. Maybe he learned that from you. If you received this, please write back. I would like to know what happened to you, whether you made it home, whether you had a life after the war. Respectfully, Patricia Morrison Hayes, Chillicothe, Ohio. Lotte. Read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Franz found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter in her hands, and sat beside her without speaking until she was ready to explain. It was him, she said finally. The soldier who brought the blankets. His name was Jack Morrison. He kept a journal, he remembered. Franz read the letter over her shoulder. "Are you going to write back?" Yes, Lotte said. "Yes, I am." She spent a week composing her reply, writing and rewriting until the words felt right. "Dear Patricia, your letter arrived today. I wept reading it. Yes, I am that Lotte Schneider. I survived. I came home to Bonn in June 1945. I married Franz Weber in 1948. We raised two children, Emma and Klaus. I taught English for 25 years. I am retired now. Your father's blankets saved us that night. Not just from cold, from despair. We had been taught Americans would torture us. Instead, your father listened when we said we were in pain and he acted. That simple mercy changed how I understood the world. I have told this story many times over 38 years, to my children, to my students, to anyone who asks about the war. I always say the American guard who brought blankets showed me that enemies can be human, that following rules with compassion matters, that small acts of decency can outweigh large acts of cruelty. I never knew his name until today. Thank you for giving me that. Please know your father did not just help us survive one cold night. He helped me survive the guilt of discovering what my country had done. Because if the enemy could show mercy, then maybe I could learn to show it too. To myself, to others, to the painful truth. I am sorry he is gone, but his legacy lives in you and my children, in everyone who hears this story and chooses kindness over cruelty. With gratitude and respect, Lotte Weber née Schneider-Bonn, Federal Republic of Germany. The correspondence continued. Patricia wrote back with stories about her father, about the dairy farm he ran after the war, about how he never talked about combat, but sometimes seemed far away, lost in memories he would not share. Lotte wrote about her teaching about Emma, who became a translator, and Klaus, who became an engineer, about rebuilding a life from ruins. In 1985, Patricia came to Bonn. She was 42 years old, her father's daughter with his brown eyes and his quiet manner. She met Lotte, and Franz met Emma and Klaus and the grandchildren. They visited the site where the warehouse had once stood, now replaced by a modern factory, and Patricia brought something wrapped in tissue paper. It was a piece of U.S. Army blanket, gray wool, with U.S. Army stamped in faded black ink. "My father kept this," Patricia said. "I found it with the journal. I think it came from that night." Lotte took the blanket piece with trembling hands. "I kept one too," she said quietly. "Let me show you." She brought out a small wooden box from her bedroom. Inside was her own piece of blanket, carefully preserved for 40 years, and 3 letters from her mother and Morrison's name written on a slip of paper, the relics of a war that had ended but never quite left. Together, Patricia and Lotte arranged for a small memorial plaque to be placed at the factory site. The ceremony was modest, attended by Lotte's family, Patricia, 2 other surviving prisoners from that warehouse who had been tracked down through Red Cross records and local officials. A German-American Historical Society helped fund it. The plaque read, "On this site, January through May 1945, German female prisoners of war were held by United States Army forces. Here, small acts of mercy transcended enmity. Here, the defeated learned that even in war, humanity can survive. May we never forget that compassion is stronger than hate." Lotte spoke at the ceremony, her voice steady despite her age. "I was 22 when I arrived here, terrified, cold, expecting cruelty. Instead, I encountered rules. I encountered the Geneva Convention being followed. I encountered a young American soldier who listened when I said lying on the floor hurt, who brought blankets because it made sense. That soldier was Jack Morrison. I never knew his name until 1983 when his daughter wrote to me, but I never forgot what he did. This plaque is not about glorifying war. War is hell. This plaque is about remembering that even in hell, humans can choose to reduce suffering rather than add to it. Germany committed atrocities. That is historical fact we cannot deny. But also a fact that American soldiers treated us according to law with occasional mercy beyond law's requirements. That contrast taught me more than any propaganda ever could. I tell my students, be suspicious of anyone who tells you enemies are not human, because once you stop seeing people as human, anything becomes possible. But also kindness becomes impossible. Mercy becomes impossible. Healing becomes impossible. Jack Morrison's blankets were not a grand gesture. They were a practical response to a problem, but they proved that even between enemies, basic human decency can exist. That is what we commemorate here. Not victory, not defeat, just the truth that sometimes in war's darkness, a small light shines. And if we pay attention, that light can guide us toward better futures. When the ceremony ended, Lotte and Patricia stood alone at the plaque for a moment. Patricia said Dad would have been embarrassed by all this fuss. Probably Lotte agreed. He seemed uncomfortable with thanks, but his discomfort does not erase the impact. I wish he had talked about it. Why didn't he? Maybe because to him, it was just obvious. You do not let people suffer unnecessarily. His father taught him that. He taught you that. The lesson passes down. Patricia nodded. My daughter is studying international humanitarian law. She wants to work for the United Nations. I think Dad would like that. He would, Lotte said. The blankets keep spreading warmth even 40 years later. They laid flowers at the plaque together, two women who should have been enemies, joined by the memory of a young soldier who chose mercy over cruelty on a cold night in January 1945. Lotte lived until 2001, dying at age 78 in the same Bonn apartment where she had raised her children. In her will, she left the blanket piece to the Bonn City Museum, where it sits now in a climate-controlled case next to Morrison's journal entry, photocopied and translated. School groups visit and read the story. Teachers explain about the Geneva Convention, about the choices individuals make, even in systems of war, about how small acts of decency matter. And sometimes in the quiet of the museum, after the school groups have left, a visitor will stand before that case for a long time, looking at the faded gray wool, reading the words and understanding something essential about what it means to choose humanity when the world offers every excuse not to. The warehouse is gone. The war is over. The people are dead, but the lesson remains. Sometimes what we remember is not what happened, but what did not happen. No torture came. No cruelty followed. Only blankets and the realization that even in war, suffering does not have to be the point. That lesson Lotte believed until her final breath is worth preserving, worth passing on, worth teaching to every generation that follows. Because the alternative, forgetting that enemies are human, forgetting that mercy is possible, forgetting that small acts of kindness can outweigh large acts of hate, that alternative leads back to the same darkness. And the world has seen enough darkness. It is time, always time, to remember the light. Even when that light is as small as a folded blanket on a cold floor. Even when it comes from unexpected hands. Especially then. That is when it matters most.